Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 5 of English 200. Well, welcome to week 5 of English 200, 201, and 202. We're going to continue to refer to chapter 4 on form and serious daring. So if you've already read that, you're all set. And we're going to be, please just read the poems that are featured in this lecture. I'm going to continue to talk about poetic forms in this lecture. We're going to look at 2 more forms to try out. And then we're going to talk about doing our first workshop. I realized there was some confusion about last week's workshop. For some reason, the assignment carried over from my last semester's class. But as I mentioned in the lecture, I did not mention the workshop. So please know that whatever I say in this lecture is what's due this week. So always go to the lecture first. The lecture will tell you what you need to do. I'm sorry for the confusion last week. We are going to be doing a workshop this week, and I look forward to seeing your revised pieces for it. So this week we're working on poetic forms. We're going to start off with something called the prose poem. And the prose poem is a poem written in prose. That means it makes every use of poetic devices that one can find in poetry, but it doesn't use the line break. The poem just is on the page like a paragraph. One of my favorite prose poems is called The Colonel by Caroline Forche. But we're also going to look at 2 more. A Story About the Body by Robert Haas and Clouds by Russell Edson. Let's start by reading A Story About the Body by Robert Haas. The young composer, working that summer at an artist's colony, had watched her for the week. She was Japanese, a painter, almost 60, and he thought he was in love with her. He loved her work, and her work was like the way she moved her body, used her hands, looked at him directly when she made amused and considered answers to his questions. One night, walking back from a concert, they came to her door, and she turned to him and said, "I think that you would like to have me. I would like that too, but I must tell you that I've had a double mastectomy." And when he didn't understand, "I've lost both my breasts." The radiance that he had carried around in his belly and chest cavity like music withered very quickly, and he made himself look at her when he said, "I'm sorry, I don't think I could." He walked back to his own cabin, through the pines, and in the morning he found a small blue bowl on the porch outside his door. It looked to be full of rose petals, but he found, when he picked it up, that the rose petals were on top. The rest of the bowl, she must have swept them from the corners of her studio, was full of dead bees. Now I'm going to skip ahead to I'd like to talk a little bit about this poem before we go on to the next example. So this poem tells a story like it's a parable. I want you to think about how Robert Haas tells the story of the man at the writer's colony and the woman with the double mastectomy without using abstract words. He really thinks about, he gives us all these details in this poem, right? It tells a very small story, but look at all the things that he's very specific about in this poem. Please make sure that you pay attention that when you write a tiny, tiny story of this quality, you need to really use a lot of poetic language. Otherwise, it's not as powerful. Here's another one by Caroline Forche, The Colonel. What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was English. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said, "Hello," on the terrace. The colonel told it to shut up, and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, "Say nothing." The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into the water glass. It came alive there. "I'm tired of fooling around," he said. "As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves." He swept the ears to the floor with his arm, and held the last of his wine in the air. "Something for your poetry, no?" he said. Some of the ears on the floor caught this scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground. So in Forshay's little story, right? How does she tell the story of the colonel without using abstract words, right? She's using very serious details, and she uses, right, that final image in the final image in both of these poems tells a really, really big story, right? The blue bowl with the rose petals and bees is telling us an emotion, right? That we have to think about and react to. Same thing with the ears that are listening and pressed to the ground in the end of the kernel. So I want you to try, for this example, I'd like you to try to write a loaded story like one of these, where instead of providing an ending, you give us a really, really intense image like these two poems provided. Now here's another version of the prose poem. This poem is called Clouds by Russell Edson. A husband and wife climbed the roof to their house, and at each extreme of the ridge stood facing the other, while... I'm sorry, there's a typo. Let me try it again. A husband and wife climbed the roof to their house, and at each extreme of the ridge they stood facing the other, while the clouds took to form and reform. The husband said, "Shall we do backward dives and into windows floating come kissing in a central room?" "I am standing on the bottom of an overturned boat," said the wife. The husband said, "Shall I somersault along the ridge of the roof and up your legs and through your dress, out of the neck of your dress to kiss you?" "I am a roof statue on a temple in an archaeologist's dream," said the wife. The husband said, "Let us go down now and do what it is to make another come into the world." "Look," said the wife, "the eternal clouds." So, writing the absurd parable in order to speak the unspeakable. That's what Russell Edson is doing. He's talking about a relationship between a man and a wife, right? But he tells it in a way that's really absurd. How does the absurdity affect the poem? What truths do you think he's talking about through these absurd images, right? What is the viewpoint of the wife? What is the viewpoint of the husband? So I want you to think about how he constructed this poem, and then I want you to write an absurd parable, like this one, about two people. They can be lovers or a mother and a daughter or two friends. And I'd like you to place them somewhere they shouldn't be, like the roof of a house, and have them speak together in images that convey emotion, just like Russell Edson does in his poem. All right, so those are your two attempts, right? Like you to try those two, and then use one of the starters that you did to write your own prose poem that's at least 10 sentences long. You must use figures of speech and sound throughout your poem. Use specific language, right? Don't just say bird, say red-tailed hawk, right? And do not use any abstract words like happy, sad, envious, beautiful, right? Use images instead, and remember to include metaphors or similes, repetition, alliteration, assonance, consonants, and internal rhyme, okay? Pack that all into your tiny little prose poem. Another form of poetry I want us to take a look at is called the pantoum. And it's actually a really interesting history of this form. It's a Malay song from that was adapted by the French poets in the 19th century, and it came into English from the poets who imitated the French. The pantoum has a 4-line stanza. The second and fourth lines of each stanza become the first and third lines of the next stanza. So when you write a pantoum, it's actually like almost like weaving a basket, and we'll talk a little bit about that. First, let's look at a couple of examples. The first is Fortune's Pantoum, and this is by Jane Shore. Jane Shore is a wonderful poet. She's actually married to the novelist Howard Norman, who, if you haven't read him, you have a treat ahead of you. She wrote this poem. She found a bunch of really interesting fortunes from fortune cookies, and then she threw in some lines that she wrote herself, and she made this pantoum. Fortune's Pantoum. You will go on a long journey. You will have a happy and healthy life. You will recover valuables thought lost. You will marry and have children. You will have a happy and healthy life. Your sweetheart will always be faithful. You will marry and have many children. You will have many friends when you need them. Your sweetheart will always be faithful. Soon you will come into a large inheritance. You will have many friends when you need them. You will succeed in your line of work. Soon you will come into a large inheritance. You will travel to many new places. You will succeed in your line of work. Be suspicious of well-meaning strangers. You will travel to many new places. A message from a distance is soon to be received. Be suspicious of well-meaning strangers. Important news from an unexpected source. A message from a distance is soon to be received. You will meet a dark and handsome foreigner. Important news from an unexpected source. Do not take unnecessary chances. You will meet a dark and handsome foreigner. You will have a fear of visiting high places. Do not take unnecessary chances. Your misunderstanding will be cleared up in time. You have a fear of visiting high places. Grasp at the shadow and lose the substance. Your misunderstanding will be cleared up in time. Sometimes you worry too much about death. Grasp at the shadow and lose the substance. You will recover valuables thought lost. Sometimes you worry too much about death. You will go on a long journey. So notice how Jane Shore weaves together and the poem comes back together at the end. You see that the last stanza has line 3 becomes the second line in the last stanza, and the first line of the poem also becomes the last line of the poem. I'll talk a little bit in a second about how you weave through like this, what the pattern is. There's a very exact pattern. Here's Pantoum of the Great Depression by Donald Justice. Our lives avoided tragedy simply by going on, without end and with little apparent meaning. Oh, there were storms and small catastrophes. Simply by going on we managed. No need for the heroic. Oh, there were storms and small catastrophes. I don't remember all the particulars. We managed. No need for the heroic. There were the usual celebrations, the usual sorrows. I don't remember all the particulars. Across the fence the neighbors were our chorus. There were the usual celebrations, the usual sorrows. Thank God no one said anything in verse. The neighbors were our only chorus, and if we suffered we kept quiet about it. At no time did anyone say anything in verse. It was the ordinary pities and fears consumed us, and if we suffered, we kept quiet about it. No audience would ever know our story. It was the ordinary pities and fears consumed us. We gathered on porches, the moon rose, we were poor. What audience would ever know our story? Beyond our windows shone the actual world. We gathered on porches, the moon rose, we were poor, and time went by, drawn by slow horses, and somewhere beyond our windows shone the world. The Great Depression had entered our souls like fog. And time went by, drawn by slow horses. We did not ourselves know what the end was. The Great Depression had entered our souls like fog. We had our flaws, perhaps a few private virtues. But we did not ourselves know what the end was. People like us simply go on. We have our flaws, perhaps a few private virtues, but it is by blind chance only that we escape tragedy, and there is no plot in that. It is devoid of poetry. Now, Donald Justice, you see in this version of a pantoum, he changes it in some ways. He adapts the form so he can tell his story, right, about the Great Depression. And notice how through repetition, we get to know more and more about the people he's talking about. Finally, I'm going to read you one of my poems. This is called The Dress, and it's from my first book, Gold Passage. And I am, in this poem, I am also adapting lines so that they are that they change throughout the form. So I do use the format of the pantoum, but I switch it around so that I can tell the story, because in the story things change between the two girls. The Dress. The lemon yellow dress hangs in the room that curves like a nautilus. He says, "I've made this dress for you." Paris, green folding chairs freckling the weave of tan gravel paths. Time has rolled us around to this moment. Curving like a nautilus, he says, "I've made this dress for you." She stands like Aphrodite, naked in the open room. Time has rolled us around to this moment, the dress falling over her body like light or air. She stands like Aphrodite, naked in the open room. Sky darkens as we heave up the slope to Stein's grave. Dress falling over her body like light or air. The Polaroid speaks of contrast. Sky darkens as we heave up the slope toward Stein's grave. You can see the joy rising like the text of a lost manuscript in the Polaroid that speaks of contrast. Later, we will leave questions like stones. You can see the joy rising like the text of a lost manuscript. After, the wind will carry us like seeds, where we will sift through a pile of stones and bloom into bright sycamores. I must have been carried by the wind. I must have been carried by the wind to have landed so far away here, planted, yet still blooming, a bright scarred sycamore. But you remain there, unattested as joy. Paris, green folding chairs freckling the weave of tan gravel paths, the nautilus still turns between us, and always at its center stands the lemon yellow dress. All right, guys, now it's your turn to write a pantoum. Here is the way that the stanzas go. In the first stanza, you're just going to write 4 lines. Make sure those 4 lines have rich imagery in them, because you're going to be repeating them, okay? The second stanza, line 5 will be a repeat of line 2 from stanza 1. And remember, you can change the lines when you repeat them. Line 6 will be a new line. Line 7 will repeat line 4 in stanza 1. And again, you can change it. And then line 8 will be a new line. You'll continue this pattern in stanza 3 and stanza 4. You can add in more stanzas using the same pattern, but you must do at least 4 stanzas plus a last stanza. So it should be at least a 5-stanza poem. The last stanza, line 17, is line 2 of the previous stanza, but line 18 is line 3 of the first stanza. So you go back to the first stanza. Then line 19 is line 4 of the previous stanza, stanza 4. And then line 20 is line 1 of the first stanza. So the last line of the poem is the same as the first line of the poem, if that makes sense. Have fun with this form. It's really, it's fun to kind of weave through this. And it's good to do to write a pantoum about a topic that changes over time in some way, shows some sort of progression. That's the best topic to write a pantoum about. Have fun with it, you guys. All right, now for you English 201, 202 poets, we are still poeming a day. February 11th, I think you already have the prompt, but I'm going to give it to you again. You're to read a collection of poems that you love, and then choose 4 lines from 4 separate poems that you weave through your own poem of at least 14 lines. Then on the 12th, you're going to write a poem where you speak for those without a voice. Then on the 13th, you're going to think about, and you can interpret that however you want. February 13th, I want you to think about an unusual ritual or belief among your family, friends, or community, and write a poem about your knowledge of its origins and how it has evolved over the years, what has been lost or gained with time. And on the 14th, on Valentine's Day, I'd like you to write an apocalyptic poem, and you can interpret this any way that you want. February 15th, I'd like you to write a poem that contains the word appleseed, cricket, callus, soil, and stuffed. February 16th, I'd like you to write a poem that takes inspiration from an absence or emptiness of a person, place, or feeling. February 17th, make a list of objects or that's played a prominent role in your life in the past 2 or 3 years, including items that have figured into international news. So, you can think of any object or thing that's in the last 3 years that you've that's been of significance. It could be personal, it could be national, it could be international. And then I want you to write a poem in response to a selection of these objects. You can also just make a list poem of all the objects. But I want you to explore any emotional ties you have to them and their significance to larger social issues. On the 18th, I want you to write a poem in at least 3 parts that uses a scientific term. And then on the 19th, I want you to write a poem with the word Hansel in it. And the definition is here in this link. Finally, guys, you are going to be doing your first workshop. So I know last week there was some confusion, but I would not have you do a workshop without actually getting some instruction. So this week we are actually doing a workshop. You guys are expected to revise one of the poems that you've already written for this class. You must use a poem that you've already written for this class. Ideally, you're going to use one that you turned in as a formal assignment and have revised based on my comments. You can also just send, if there's an exercise that you've done that you want to work on, you can send it to me and we can talk about it as well, or stop by my office hours. But before you submit your poem for a workshop, you need to revise your poem significantly. And revising is not just editing and proofreading, although those things are very important. First drafts are scattered attempts at finding the territory that you're going to be working in. Here are some of the basic guidelines on how to revise your poems. I want you to think about, do you know why you break each of your lines where they currently end? Think about it. Why are you breaking there? Do your line breaks generate suspense and surprise, making the reader want to find out what will happen next? Are you using a combination of end-stopping lines that means you have punctuation at the end, or and enjambment, that's no punctuation at the end? If you have more than one stanza, do your line groupings increase the impact of your poem's style and subject matter? Does your poem have a discernible rhythm? Can we hear the poem? Are you using any internal rhymes, alliteration, consonants, assonance? If not, then you need to add it in. Are you using sensory-rich imagery? Can the reader see, hear, taste what you're talking about? If not, how could you add it in? Do the symbols and images in your poem make sense to the general idea of the poem? Are they vivid? Are they specific? Look at the notes that I placed on your poem. Do you have any questions about what I wrote? If you do, please ask me. Write further, too. If you've finished a draft of a poem, why not explore more? Try more. Maybe you wrote a really brief poem for our class exercise, but now it's time to expand what you wrote, or to write away from the prompt. Maybe the prompt was too limiting. Don't be afraid to break the rules at this point. And always, before you submit your poem, read it aloud to yourself so you can hear it. Also, go through and look for any abstract words, get rid of them, or any cliches. So here's the directions for your first workshop. I want you to revise one of your poems and post it as part of the discussion, workshop number 1. You want to upload your poem as a Word document or PDF by Thursday at 11:59 p.m. And you will not see your peers' posts until you've actually uploaded your poem. Then I'd like you to respond to at least 3 of your peers' poems by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. by following these steps. First, download his or her poem. Then read it aloud to yourself. Read it again on the page. And then choose one immediate positive thing to say about his or her piece. For example, did one of the images strike you? Or did you like the title? Or did you like how the poem ended? Then read the poem line by line and provide extensive comments. Try and use the terminology that we've been discussing in class. Write down what you think the poem means. If the poem is unclear, tell the poet what is unclear. Look at how he or she is using sound in the poem. Look at the images he or she is using. Are they sensory rich? Are they specific? Are there any abstract words? How could he or she replace those abstract words with images? Look at the line breaks and stanza breaks. Do they make sense? Do they help convey the meaning of the poem? Are the lines short or long? Do they create the right pace in the poem? Is the poem in form? And if so, how is he or she using that form or working against that form in the poem? And do you think it's making the poem have more meaning? All right, guys, that's it for this week. As always, if you have any questions, please come by my office hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11 to 12:30 and 1:30 to 3. Although this week the college is closed on Thursday, so I will not be in my office hours. There are only office hours on Tuesday this week. You can always shoot me an email if you have questions, and I'd be happy to answer them. All right, guys, have a great week writing. I'll see you online.